as has been said, is I'm getting a okay. So this talk is
I forgot to mention that we record the presentation, but not the discussion. Sorry for that. Thank you, Tom, for starting this.
Okay, so this talk is an amalgamation of two papers that Sebastian and I have been working on. So we're interested in both an analysis of the commodification of attention. So what does it mean to commodify attention, as well as an ethical assessment of that. So if attention is commodified, what's wrong with that? And the focus of this talk will be primarily on the ethical assessment of that. So originally, yes, Sebastian and I did plan to give this talk jointly, but we abandoned that idea in the spirit of minimizing distraction. So Sebastian's attention is elsewhere, and he will be unable to join us today. So there are widespread worries, both in public discussion and the academic literature, about the so-called attention economy, especially as it plays out online and in social media. These worries are often connected to the idea that big tech companies like Google or Meta treat our attention as a product to be bought and sold, or as a commodity. So we have here some examples. Attention has been widely recognized as a commodity like wheat, pork bellies, or crude oil. The advertising industry and the media that serve it treat our attention as a commodity. So this idea has been especially prominent in the work of legal scholar and activist Tim Wu in his book, The Attention Merchants. And he was recently appointed as an advisor to the US National Economic Council to work on technology and competition policy. And he's the author of this first quote above. When complaints about the commodification of attention are made, two things are taken for granted. First is that attention is the kind of thing that can be treated as a commodity. And two, that treating attention as a commodity is morally problematic. But neither of these claims is self-evident. So the nature of the commodification claim is rather obscure. Can someone literally buy and sell your attention? So according to most current theories, attention is a mental state or activity, a process or modification of such mental states or processes. So in this way, attention resembles belief, working memory, or reasoning. And this invites the question, how can mental states or processes be bought and sold in the same way that cars and toothbrushes or pork bellies can be? Can we really sell such mental states or processes to others so that they, presumably and correspondingly, become owners of our mental states and processes? The second question needing an answer is what exactly is wrong with treating attention as a commodity? So in here we can ask whether the commodification of attention itself is morally problematic. Attention simply is not the kind of thing that should be bought and sold, or whether it's problematic because of the manner in which, or the environment in which it's commodified. So here we might ask whether the problems of social media or the internet that typically prompt complaints about the commodification of attention are due to how the markets have played out, or to other aspects of contemporary societies. So in response to the first question about the nature of the commodification of attention, we argue that attention is treated as a commodity when control over an agent's attention gets exchanged for another good or service in a market transaction. And we draw a parallel here to the labor market. So we make this argument in detail in another paper, but I will here sketch this account. And in response to the second question, which will be our focus here, we argue that while there's nothing in principle wrong with commodifying attention, the current unregulated commodification of attention is problematic and reflects larger structural injustices in society. So let's start with a brief sketch of the nature of the commodification claim. We think that attention is commodified when individuals lend out control over their attention in exchange for goods or services. So online, these services include the use of email, access to videos, and social networking. In these environments, individuals or individual users will give up, to a certain degree, control over what they pay attention to in exchange for said good or service. And those who have acquired that control will then exchange the control they have acquired for money. And here's what we mean by attention. And here what we mean by attention is looking at, watching, listening to, or engaging with things in the world. So attention here refers to the general prioritizing of the mind, perceptually, emotionally, or intellectually. So we think that these kinds of market exchanges that we see online have structural similarities to the labor market. So for example, when S is working for company C, S lends C in exchange for a salary, some of her capacities. C now has some level of control over the use of those capacities. Now, these capacities are valuable for C in the production of some good or service. C wouldn't be able to make as much money on those goods and services without controlling S's capabilities or capacities. And likewise, when S is using technological services, S lends big tech companies in exchange for these technological services her capacity for attention. So the big tech company now has some level of control over the use of that capacity to pay attention to some things rather than others. The big tech company then exchanges that control for financial gain in the ad exchange market. So we can see now that in this sense, attention isn't commodified in the same way that cars and toothbrushes or pork bellies are, whereby individual ownership is transferred. Instead, it's commodified as other human capacities are in the labor markets. So whereby individuals lend capacities out rather than outright transfer ownership. So here's a straightforward example that we see online. In order to watch an educational video on YouTube, you'll have to watch a short advertisement. Okay, so you lend out your attentional capacity. In doing so, you relinquish some control over what you pay attention to. And in exchange, you get to watch a video in return. Likewise, to gain access to social networking platforms, for example, Facebook, you'll have to tolerate advertisement being placed within your Facebook feed. So it's the advertisement, watching the advertisement, lending out your attentional capacities that gives you access to these networking services. Now, why, we might ask, is attention valuable or something worthy of being commodified? And there are two main answers here. So the first is that attention is an important economic influence. What we pay attention to influences our decision-making, preference and belief formation, memory, emotions, and so on. The second is that attention is controllable. So we can control it ourselves, but we can also, others can control it. We can give up control of it, and others can acquire that control. So in this way, attention is different from perception, for example. We can't control in the same way what we see or give up any control over that to others. Now, these two factors make control over attention valuable and something that others might want. So especially when we think about the kind of transactions that are at hand between users and advertisers. So the point of advertisement is to influence consumer behavior. And insofar as attention serves as a gateway to our preferences and desires, control over it is valuable. And given that attention is something that is valuable to others, we can then give it up and get something that we want in return. Now, I do want to say a brief thing here to distinguish our focus of attention from personalized data, right? So we might ask, why would we focus on attention rather than personal data? That is, after all, what we generally agree to have shared when we consent to the use of online platforms insofar as we read the fine print. Now, we think that data is probably also commodified, but that this is only indirectly valuable as a means to better affect what one pays attention to and in turn influence behavior. So the data collected might reveal, for example, that an individual is already interested in hiking. And so companies can then tailor what the individual pays attention to in that way by placing advertisement for hiking boots on the platform. So the data serves as sort of an indirect way of ultimately influencing behavior through controlling individual attention. So we now move on to the question whether it's wrong that attention is commodified. And here we draw on some of the philosophical literature on the ethics of commodification. So the ethics of commodification concerns questions about the ethical status of selling particular goods and services. Are there some things that should never be bought and sold? So some examples of so-called contested commodities include physical goods like organs, necessary goods like health, civic goods like votes, and capacities like a reproductive capacity. Now, given that our focus is on the commodification of attention, which is a human capacity, we will confine our focus to what we might call contested capacities like reproductive labor. And we'll here consider two options with respect to the complaint that the commodification of attention is morally problematic. The first is that the wrongs associated with the commodification of attention are specifically due to the commodification of attention. Okay, so attention simply isn't the kind of thing that should ever enter the market sphere. The second is that the wrongs associated with the commodification of attention are due to larger and more general injustices, power and economic imbalances, structural forms of discrimination, and so on. And as I've said at the outset, we'll argue for the second option. So here's an overview of some of the objections to commodification that have come up in the contested commodities literature. And these have all, in fact, in various ways been made about markets in reproductive labor in particular. So the first family of objections asserts that a particular capacity simply is not the kind of thing that should ever be bought and sold. And there are varying reasons for that claim. One is that the commodification of a good or capacity is incompatible with our autonomy. And we'll talk a little bit more about what these objections amount to shortly. Another argument in the same family is that certain markets alienate us from our identities. And the third is that some markets reduce persons to objects of mere use. The second family of objections does not in principle rule out particular capacities or goods as things that should ever enter the marketplace, but point to the morally problematic features of those transactions. So some arguments here will appeal to the harmful effects of those markets, harms to others, harms to society, and others will appeal to the exploitative nature of those transactions. So we now move on to the first class of objections, that some things should never be bought and sold. And the first has to do with autonomy. So one might argue that one cannot lend control over one's attention because in doing so, one undermines one's autonomy. So an extreme version of this argument is that in relinquishing control over attention, one allows someone else to control one's mind. So one can imagine, if I give up all control over my attention, then, I give up all of my agency, right? So I no longer have any control over what I look at, what I think about, and any subsequent preferences or desires that I form. And on this extreme view, we might say that I'm rendered an automaton, right? Controlled from the outside by somebody else. And we might then think that even if we're staunch defenders of liberty and think that there should be very few limits on market transactions, there is a reason to pick out attention as a special case that should be excluded from the market insofar as giving up control over one's attention is undermining of autonomy. Now we can here draw a comparison between Mill on voluntary slavery. So Mill, of course, touted the value of autonomy and thought that there ought to be very few restrictions on it. But voluntarily selling oneself into slavery is ultimately a self-defeating of any exercise of autonomy. Now we can point out an obvious disanalogy between the two markets. When one voluntarily sells oneself into slavery, one does so permanently. But one can log off of Facebook, right? So in this way, a market in attention resembles more closely the labor market more than it does voluntary slavery. So we temporarily give up control over certain capacities, and then regain them at the end of the day when the workday is done or when we log off in the online environment. And insofar as we think that the temporary relinquishing of capacities in the labor market is compatible with individual autonomy, we can think the same here. But it should be noted, arguably, the influence that we are exposed to online extends beyond the time that you are logged on. Now, that's the point of advertisement, right? To shape your behavior in ways that align with the goals of the advertiser. Advertisers want to shape your preferences and desires so that they'll buy you their products. And if so, we might wonder to what extent exposure to this influence online really is compatible with our agency. Now, if we maintained no control over our attention, that would be problematic. So if I gave up all control over my attention, as I do in the case I described earlier, then it would be hard to find a way to preserve individual agency. But there is a middle ground between having absolute control and having none at all. And I think that this middle ground better represents the influence that we expose ourselves to online. And so we do presumably maintain some level of agency in these interactions. It should also be noted that we are exposed to influence everywhere. Offline advertisement isn't new. We see it in newspapers, magazines, on TV, and billboards. And we generally do not think that mere exposure to these kinds of influence undermines our autonomy. There are also social structures, individual relationships that will influence what we come to desire and the kinds of people that we are. And we can't plausibly think that the mere presence of an external factor in shaping our preferences or desires is enough to render us non-autonomous. So we then have to decide where this middle ground is. And I don't here have an answer to that. But all of this is to say that the mere fact that we expose ourselves to influence online isn't sufficient to undermine autonomy, and much more argument is needed to make that case. Now, in the spirit of time, I'm going to skip over the discussion of connection to identities, and we can take that up in the discussion if we like. The next objection that I want to consider is that the commodification of attention reduces persons to objects of mere use. So one might argue that in selling user attention, technology companies are reducing persons to objects of mere use. They're treating users as mere means for financial profit. And this, we might say, is a violation of the Kantian ideal that individuals should be treated with respect, that profiting from control over individual attention is a failure to recognize individuals as autonomous agents with preferences and desires of their own. Now, we should note that the same general kind of complaint can be raised in other market transactions. So one might say that I use a plumber as a mere means to my toilet being fixed. But we should also note that what makes transactions of this sort compatible with respect for persons and makes it be the case that I'm not merely using this individual as a mere means to an end, is that I in return give the plumber something that they want, namely money. And we might say the same thing in the case of the attention economy. So technology companies profit from control over our attention, but they do give us something in return. We get access to something that we want, access to email or social networking. And in so doing, tech companies show us sufficient respect as persons with our own desires and goals. Now, we might worry, however, that the transaction online is different from other kinds of market transactions. So the point of gaining control over attention is to influence our desires in ways that benefit the influencer. And this we might think is incompatible with respect for persons. How can you respect a person as an individual with their own preferences and desires if your sole aim in interacting with that individual is to shift their preferences? Now, it is important to note that when an agent wants to and even attempts to change the preferences or desires of another, one does not necessarily fail to respect a person. Okay, so suppose that you and I are on a hiring committee. I think that we should hire candidate X, and you think that we should hire candidate Y. I may want to change your opinion on this and offer you some arguments for why we should select candidate X over Y. And in doing so, I'm not failing to respect you as a person. I'm treating you rather as a rational agent who's responsive to reasons. Now, if on the other hand, I sought to change your mind through brainwashing, then we would likely agree that this fails to show respect for you as a person. But the mere fact that I want to change your mind does not. So coming back to this initial worry, merely seeking to gain or gaining control over one's attention doesn't alone fail to show disrespect for persons. It's the means by which influence is exercised that's potentially problematic. So if we think about this gate analogy of attention being a gateway to our preferences and desires, the problem isn't with losing control over the gate, but with what comes through the gate. So the upshot so far is that there's probably nothing intrinsically wrong with the commodification of attention. We now move on to the question of whether there are problems with the way that attention is commodified in the current attention economy. So the first argument appeals to harm, and this includes harm to individuals and to society. So Castro and Pham, in a paper that they wrote on the attention economy and its noxious effects, have argued that a market in attention leads to individual harm, since the consumption of new media correlates with and arguably causes mental health problems in both teenagers and adults, so increases depression and feelings of loneliness and so on. They also argue that there are societal harms. So with a view to capture attention for advertisement, technology companies will offer personalized information streams. These personalized information streams, they argue, will then lead to echo chambers, drive extremism and polarization, and thus undermine democratic ideals, in extreme cases causing public violence. Now, Castro and Pham in their paper seem to conflate the use of new media in general and the attention economy, and don't spell out exactly how these harms flow from a market in attention. But here's how we might spell this out more fully. So markets in attention create incentives for big tech companies to maximize user engagement. The more user engagement they have, the higher a price they can charge to advertisers. So this then incentivizes big tech companies to build their platforms with features that keep users hooked and in some cases addictive. So things like alerts, Mitchell has posted a new story, the automatic queuing of videos on YouTube, lack of stopping cues when scrolling through Instagram, for example. These are all features that are known to increase user engagement. And so the prolonged use of social media is arguably a result of the design features of new media platforms. And the harmful effects to individuals and to society are caused by, or at least correlated with, prolonged use of new media. So we can see then how the current market in attention then leads to harms at both individual and societal levels. And I do think that this is a problem that we should take seriously. It's not obvious that this is an unavoidable feature of the market in attention, but what's clear is that changes to the market as it currently stands in the form of regulation are necessary. So I now move on to the last objection that we're going to consider here, and that is concerning exploitation. So on one account of exploitation, A exploits B if A takes unfair advantage of B. Taking unfair advantage can be understood either in terms of value or agency. Okay, so in terms of value, the unfairness of the transaction might lie in the compensation offered to B. So on this view, A takes unfair advantage of B if the compensation offered to B is unfair. In terms of agency, the transaction might be unfair to B if there's a defect in B's consent. So this can arise, for example, if B is not adequately informed or if they're coerced in some way. I think that it's an interesting question whether the compensation that users get is commensurate with what they give up in return in the attention economy. But I'm going to here focus on the question of consent. So we can now ask whether big tech companies exploit their users. So is the transaction between A and B, big tech being A and B, the users, unfair? Is there a defect in consent? And one might suggest that big tech takes advantage of the fact that the users depend heavily on what they can offer. Okay, and this calls into question the extent to which user consent to lend their attention is genuine. So in many cases, use of these platforms are essential to social life. In many cases, essential to one's professional life. So giving up all of these things would make life very difficult for one who would do such a thing. There's thus a very high exit cost involved here for the user who does not wish to consent to having her attention controlled. So we might say here that were it not for the fact that she desperately needs what big tech can provide her with, a user would not have agreed to the terms of the agreement. So in other words, her consent is less than voluntary. So a core problem here is the existence of a power imbalance between A and B, or between big tech and its users. So this enables A to demand something of B in a way that we think is problematic. So think about an offline case of exploitation. Walmart employees work for very little in terms of wage, very few breaks during their workday. Now, in some sense, both parties gain. Walmart gets employees to do the work for them, and the workers receive a wage and compensation. But we think that the employers here are exploiting their workers. There's a power imbalance such that the bargaining power that the workers have to receive a better offer from their employees is difficult, if not impossible. And likewise, Facebook or Meta and Google are quasi-monopolies. And as such, we lack the availability of suitable alternatives. This then generates a power imbalance between us and these companies and opens the door to the possibility of exploitation. So we might ask whether these charges of exploitation can be remedied. And it's not clear how one might approach remedying the worries that are raised about exploitation in the commodification of attention. One suggestion would be to break up the monopolies, right? And there is something very problematic about so much power concentrated in so few hands. One might also suggest giving users more choice concerning which platforms to use. So one might, for example, introduce platforms that users then can pay to use rather than trade their attention for services, giving them some choice. Now, I think that the problem with this solution is that it will leave those who can afford to pay with the option of doing so, and those who cannot must then resign themselves to trading their attention in exchange for services. So we get sort of two-tiered system. And this option just perpetuates already existing social inequalities. So this thus brings me to the conclusion, and that's that there are indeed problems with an unregulated market in attention as it currently stands. As far as we can tell, there is nothing in principle wrong with the commodification of attention. But the combination of incentive structures and power imbalances generate harmful effects and provide fertile grounds for exploitation. So we do think that the market in attention needs to be regulated. The remaining question is how, and we will leave that to future work to develop. And I look forward to any comments that you might have on that. Thank you.